On the 26th of April, 1986, a routine safety test at Chernobyl nuclear power plant became the worst accident in the history of civilian nuclear power. Within hours, radioactive material was released across Europe, a modern city would be abandoned, and confidence in nuclear technology would be permanently altered. The disaster occurred at reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union. Just 3 kilometers away stood Pripyat, a purpose-built city of almost 50,000 people. Home to plant workers and their families, it represented Soviet confidence in science, engineering, and technological progress. During the 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet Union rapidly expanded its nuclear power program to meet growing electricity demand. Nuclear stations supplied industry, cities, and strategic infrastructure while serving as symbols of national achievement. Chernobyl's reactors were of the RBMK design. They used graphite to moderate neutrons and ordinary water as coolant, allowing continuous refueling during operation. The design offered operational advantages, but also possessed characteristics that demanded strict adherence to operating procedures. At very low power, the RBMK could become unstable. Under certain conditions, increasing steam within the reactor increased, rather than reduced, the nuclear reaction. These characteristics were known to reactor designers, but were not fully understood by many operating crews. Earlier technical studies had identified weaknesses within the reactor design, yet comprehensive modifications had not been introduced across the RBMK fleet before 1986. As a result, critical design vulnerabilities remained in service. Operators worked within a highly structured system where production targets, formal procedures, and hierarchical decision-making shaped daily operations. Technical competence was expected, but questioning established plans was uncommon. By 1986, Chernobyl operated 4 reactors and ranked among the Soviet Union's largest power stations. Thousands of engineers, technicians, and support staff maintained round-the-clock electricity generation. Reactor 4 had entered service only a few years earlier and was regarded as a dependable generating unit. Few believed that an accident capable of destroying the reactor itself was possible. The planned experiment aimed to determine whether the inertia of the turbine generators could provide electrical power for a short period after an external power loss, bridging the gap before emergency diesel generators reached full operating speed. The test was intended to improve emergency preparedness rather than challenge reactor safety. Under normal conditions, it could be performed safely if operating procedures were followed and reactor conditions remained stable. Unexpected demand on the regional electricity grid delayed the planned reduction in reactor power. Hours later than intended, the experiment resumed with a different operating shift than originally scheduled. The incoming night crew inherited a reactor that no longer matched the conditions anticipated in the original test program. They continued preparations while attempting to recover the required operating state. No one entering the control room expected a catastrophe. The operators believed they were completing a technical procedure at a reactor that had operated successfully for years. As preparations continued after midnight, control rods, coolant flow, and reactor output became the focus of careful attention. Individually, each adjustment appeared routine, but together they gradually moved the reactor toward increasingly unstable conditions. Outside the station, Pripyat remained peaceful. Families slept, children looked forward to the weekend, and the lights of the power station glowed on the horizon as they had every night before. Inside the control room, engineers prepared to begin the final stages of the safety test. Within minutes, technical decisions, hidden design flaws, and human judgment would combine to produce one of history's greatest technological disasters. The events about to unfold would expose weaknesses in reactor design, operating procedures, and organizational culture, leaving lessons that continue to shape nuclear safety around the world. Before sunrise, reactor number 4 would be destroyed, Pripyat's future would be sealed, and the name Chernobyl would become synonymous with nuclear disaster. Operators began reducing Reactor 4's power to prepare for the turbine rundown test. The goal was to reach a stable operating level where engineers could measure whether the spinning turbine could continue supplying electricity during the brief delay before emergency diesel generators started. Because the test had been delayed for several hours, the night shift inherited a reactor operating under conditions different from those originally planned. Even before the experiment began, the reactor was no longer following its intended schedule. During the power reduction, reactor output fell much lower than expected. Xenon, a neutron-absorbing fission product, accumulated within the core and suppressed the nuclear reaction, a condition known as xenon poisoning. Rather than waiting for the xenon to decay naturally, operators attempted to restore power so the delayed experiment could proceed. This decision required further adjustments to reactor controls. To increase output, numerous control rods were withdrawn from the core. These rods normally absorbed neutrons and regulated the chain reaction. Removing too many reduced the reactor's operating safety margin. Operating rules required a minimum number of control rods to remain inserted. Later investigations concluded that this limit had been exceeded as operators struggled to recover the desired power level. Eventually, the reactor stabilized at approximately 200 megawatts thermal, far below its normal operating power. Although sufficient for the test, this was also one of the RBMK reactor's least stable operating regions. Several automatic protection systems were disabled or bypassed to prevent the experiment being interrupted. While permitted under certain testing conditions, fewer safeguards remained available if the reactor behaved unexpectedly. High coolant flow continued through the reactor, while many control rods remained withdrawn. This combination created a delicate balance in which relatively small changes could produce disproportionately large effects inside the core. The RBMK reactor possessed a positive void coefficient. As steam bubbles replaced liquid water within the coolant channels, neutron absorption fell, allowing reactor power to increase rather than decrease under certain conditions. Although reactor designers understood this characteristic, many operating crews did not fully appreciate how dangerous it could become during low-power operation combined with extensive control rod withdrawal. Shortly after 1 o'clock in the morning, preparations entered their final phase. Operators confirmed instrument readings, coordinated with turbine personnel, and prepared to begin the long-delayed experiment. The test itself was straightforward. Steam supplying the turbine would be shut off, allowing the spinning generator to slow naturally, while engineers measured whether its remaining momentum could provide temporary electrical power. At approximately 1:23 a.m., the experiment began. Steam flow to the turbine was reduced, and the generators started slowing exactly as planned. As turbine speed decreased, electrical power available to some cooling pumps also fell. Water flow through the reactor changed, increasing the formation of steam within the fuel channels. The growing steam production increased reactor reactivity. Power began rising unexpectedly, and conditions inside the core changed more rapidly than the operators realized. Years of design decisions, operating procedures, and technical compromises were now converging. Within seconds, the reactor entered a condition from which recovery would become increasingly unlikely. Control room instruments showed abnormal readings as operators attempted to understand the rapidly changing situation. The experiment intended to improve safety had instead placed Reactor 4 on the edge of catastrophe. As reactor power rose unexpectedly, the operating crew attempted to regain control. The instruments showed increasingly abnormal readings, but they did not reveal exactly what was happening deep inside the reactor core. Recognizing that conditions were deteriorating, the operators initiated an emergency shutdown. At approximately 1:23:40 a.m., the Z5 button was pressed, commanding every control rod to enter the reactor and stop the nuclear chain reaction. Instead of immediately reducing power, the shutdown triggered an unexpected design flaw. The graphite tips fitted to the lower ends of the control rods displaced neutron-absorbing water before the absorber sections entered the core, briefly increasing reactivity. Under normal operating conditions, this effect was insignificant. On this night, however, with the reactor unstable and most control rods already withdrawn, it accelerated an already dangerous situation. Within seconds, reactor power surged to many times its design capacity. Fuel channels ruptured, temperatures rose uncontrollably, and pressure built faster than the reactor's structure could withstand. A massive steam explosion tore through the reactor vessel, destroying internal components and lifting the enormous upper biological shield from the reactor. The core was catastrophically damaged. Almost immediately, a second explosion followed. Whether driven primarily by hydrogen, additional steam, or other gases released during the destruction remains debated, but its effect was undeniable. The reactor building was ripped apart, exposing the core directly to the atmosphere. Burning graphite and fragments of nuclear fuel were thrown across the station. For the first time in the history of commercial nuclear power, an exposed graphite-moderated reactor burned in the open air, releasing radioactive material high into the atmosphere. Inside the control room, confusion replaced routine procedure. Alarms sounded continuously, communications became unreliable, and many operators struggled to believe that the reactor itself had been destroyed. Initial reports suggested a ruptured pipe or conventional industrial explosion. The idea that the reactor core no longer existed seemed almost unimaginable, delaying a full understanding of the disaster. Workers leaving the damaged buildings encountered twisted steel, shattered concrete, and blocks of graphite scattered around the site. Many approached these fragments without realizing they were intensely radioactive. Radiation cannot be detected by human senses. Without accurate instruments, personnel unknowingly entered areas where exposure levels were capable of causing severe injury within minutes. Many dosimeters quickly reached their maximum reading and could measure no higher. Instead of revealing the true radiation levels, they falsely suggested conditions were far less extreme than they actually were. Conflicting reports spread through the station. Some supervisors believed the reactor remained intact, while others recognized that catastrophic structural failure had occurred. Valuable time was lost as officials tried to reconcile impossible observations. The exposed graphite moderator ignited, creating a fire that carried radioactive particles into the atmosphere. Winds soon began transporting contamination far beyond the boundaries of the power station. Emergency services were immediately dispatched. Firefighters traveling from Pripyat believed they were responding to a major industrial fire. Few knew they were heading toward one of the most radioactive environments ever encountered by civilian emergency crews. Inside the plant, surviving workers searched for colleagues, assessed damage, and attempted to restore cooling systems where possible. Amid smoke, darkness, and uncertainty, the true scale of the catastrophe was only beginning to emerge. In less than a minute, a routine safety experiment had become the worst accident in the history of civilian nuclear power. The challenge was no longer saving the reactor, but limiting the consequences of its destruction. As radioactive material continued escaping into the atmosphere, the first responders entered the station unaware that their courage during the coming hours would become one of the defining stories of the Chernobyl disaster. Minutes after the explosions, fire crews from Pripyat arrived believing they faced a serious industrial fire. Their immediate objective was to stop the flames spreading to Reactor 3 and neighboring facilities. None realized they were entering an area of extreme radiation. Among the first responders were firefighters led by Lieutenant Volodymyr Pravik and Lieutenant Viktor Kybnok. They climbed onto burning rooftops to extinguish fires started by debris thrown from the destroyed reactor, working with extraordinary courage despite having no protection against intense radiation. The greatest immediate threat was the fire around the turbine hall and adjoining buildings. Preventing it from spreading was critical to protecting nearby reactors and essential electrical systems. As they worked, many firefighters developed unusual symptoms, including nausea, dizziness, and a metallic taste in the mouth. Few recognized these as the early effects of acute radiation exposure, believing instead they were suffering from smoke or exhaustion. Inside the damaged station, engineers continued attempting to restore cooling systems. Conflicting reports, failed instruments, and damaged communications meant many still believed the reactor remained largely intact. Radiation levels varied dramatically across the site. Some areas appeared relatively safe, while others delivered potentially lethal doses within minutes. Without high-range measuring equipment, responders unknowingly entered the most hazardous locations. Medical teams in Pripyat began treating injured workers and firefighters. Alongside burns and blast injuries, doctors encountered patients suffering symptoms that could not be explained by conventional industrial accidents. By dawn, the extent of the destruction had become unmistakable. Reactor 4 had been torn open, large sections of the building had collapsed, and smoke continued rising from the exposed core. Throughout the night, fragmented reports reached officials in Moscow. Early information underestimated the scale of the accident, reflecting both confusion at the plant and the slow flow of information through the Soviet administrative system. Helicopter crews flew over the reactor to assess the damage. These flights confirmed that the core had been destroyed and that radioactive material continued escaping into the atmosphere, despite exposing the aircrews to elevated radiation. The burning graphite moderator carried radioactive particles high into the air. Winds dispersed contamination across Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond, transforming a local industrial accident into an international environmental emergency. Meanwhile, life in nearby Pripyat continued almost normally. Residents walked the streets, children played outdoors, and families carried on with their weekend, unaware that radiation levels throughout the city were steadily increasing. Some people gathered to watch the distant glow above the power station, unaware that invisible radioactive fallout was drifting across the surrounding area. What appeared to be a spectacular fire was, in reality, one of the most dangerous releases of radiation in history. By the end of the first day, many visible fires had been extinguished, preventing further damage to neighboring facilities. The bravery of the first responders had limited the industrial consequences of the accident, though many had already received life-threatening radiation doses. Specialist teams arriving with more capable radiation instruments confirmed the true scale of the disaster. The reactor could not be repaired. The priority had become protecting the public while containing an ongoing release of radioactive material. Officials now faced an unprecedented crisis. Thousands of people remained living only a few kilometers from the destroyed reactor, while radioactive contamination continued spreading across the region. Although evidence of severe contamination continued to grow, evacuation was delayed while transport was organized and senior authorities assessed the situation. Every passing hour increased unnecessary public exposure. The explosions had ended, but the disaster had only begun. The next challenge would be evacuating an entire city, while engineers searched for a way to contain a reactor that no longer existed as a functioning machine. On the afternoon of the 27th of April, 1986, almost 36 hours after the explosion, authorities ordered the evacuation of Pripyat. Residents were told to take only essential documents, basic clothing and necessities, believing they would return within a few days. Hundreds of buses entered the city in one of the largest emergency evacuations in Soviet history. Police and officials directed families to collection points while attempting to keep the operation calm and orderly. Most residents still knew very little about the accident. Although they had seen helicopters, emergency vehicles, and unusual activity at the power station, few understood that invisible radioactive contamination had made their homes unsafe. People left meals on tables, photographs on shelves, and possessions in their homes. Pets were often left behind, and apartment doors were closed with the expectation that life would soon return to normal. For almost everyone, it was a permanent farewell they did not yet recognize. Within hours, Pripyat stood almost empty. Schools, hospitals, shops, and public buildings were abandoned, creating one of the most recognizable ghost cities in the world. Meanwhile, radioactive material continued spreading across Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and much of Europe. The release included iodine-131, cesium-137, strontium-90, and other radioactive isotopes carried by changing weather systems. The wider world first realized something was wrong when radiation alarms activated at Sweden's Forsmark nuclear power plant on the 28th of April. Investigations soon confirmed that the contamination had originated far beyond Sweden's borders. Faced with growing international scrutiny, Soviet authorities publicly acknowledged that an accident had occurred at Chernobyl, although early announcements revealed little about its true severity. Scientists began mapping radioactive fallout across Europe. Rainfall caused contamination to accumulate unevenly, leaving some regions heavily affected, while nearby areas received comparatively little deposition. A 30-kilometer exclusion zone was established around the power station. Additional villages and farming communities were evacuated as surveys revealed contamination, extending far beyond Pripyat itself. Over the following weeks, thousands more residents left their homes permanently. Entire communities disappeared from maps, and generations of family history ended with a single evacuation. At the reactor, engineers searched urgently for ways to reduce radioactive emissions and stabilize the exposed core. No previous accident had provided a blueprint for managing such a crisis. military helicopters began dropping sand, boron, clay, and lead into the destroyed reactor in an effort to suppress the graphite fire and reduce the continuing release of radioactive material. Each helicopter mission required crews to fly directly above the damaged reactor, exposing them to elevated radiation while navigating heat, smoke, and turbulent air to deliver their loads accurately. Engineers also feared that molten fuel could reach water beneath the reactor, potentially creating another steam explosion. Emergency work focused on reducing this risk before conditions worsened. Within days, the disaster had grown into a massive national response involving scientists, engineers, military personnel, and medical specialists. The explosions were over, but the effort to contain their consequences had only begun. The evacuation of Pripyat became one of the defining images of Chernobyl. Families departed believing they would soon return. Almost none ever lived there again. What began as a reactor accident had become an international environmental, political, and humanitarian crisis, whose effects would be studied for decades. The focus now shifted from emergency response to long-term containment. Stabilizing the destroyed reactor would require one of the largest engineering and recovery operations in history. Containing Chernobyl required one of the largest emergency operations in history. Hundreds of thousands of military personnel, engineers, construction workers, miners, medical staff, and specialists took part in the response. Together, they became known as the liquidators. The first priority was stabilizing the destroyed reactor and reducing the continued release of radioactive material. Engineers monitored temperatures, assessed structural damage, and searched for practical ways to control conditions inside the shattered core. Large quantities of highly radioactive debris remained scattered across the power station. Fragments of fuel and graphite covered rooftops and surrounding buildings, making recovery work extremely dangerous. Remote-controlled machines were deployed to clear the debris, but many failed after exposure to intense radiation. Electronics malfunctioned, forcing engineers to rely on human workers where technology proved inadequate. Teams of soldiers were sent onto the rooftops for only a few seconds at a time. Wearing protective clothing, they rushed across the contaminated surfaces, pushed radioactive debris back into the reactor ruins, and immediately withdrew to minimize their exposure. These men became known as the biorobots. Their work allowed construction and recovery efforts to continue when conventional robotic systems could not survive the environment around Reactor 4. Across the surrounding area, contaminated buildings, vehicles, and roads were cleaned or removed. Large quantities of radioactive soil were excavated, while nearby woodland, later known as the Red Forest, showed the devastating effects of intense radiation. Engineers also feared that molten nuclear fuel might reach water beneath the reactor, potentially triggering another powerful steam explosion. Although later assessments questioned the likelihood, officials treated the threat as a serious possibility. To reduce the risk, miners excavated a tunnel beneath Reactor 4. Working in exhausting underground conditions, they prepared space for a cooling system intended to stabilize the damaged reactor if required. Although the planned cooling installation was never ultimately needed, the miners completed their task under immense pressure, becoming another important part of the Chernobyl recovery effort. Scientists surveyed contamination across farmland, rivers, and settlements. Their measurements determined which areas could be cleaned, which required restrictions, and which would remain permanently abandoned. Meanwhile, firefighters, plant workers and other first responders suffering acute radiation syndrome were transferred to specialist hospitals, particularly in Moscow, where medical teams attempted treatments rarely performed on such a scale. Despite intensive care, many of the most severely exposed responders died within weeks. Others survived but faced long-term health consequences resulting from the radiation they had received while protecting others. Within the exclusion zone, daily life came to an abrupt end. Homes stood empty, schools closed, and nature slowly reclaimed abandoned streets, creating one of the world's most unusual landscapes. Construction soon began on a massive concrete and steel shelter around Reactor 4. Known as the sarcophagus, it was designed to reduce further radioactive releases and allow work to continue safely nearby. Building the structure under hazardous conditions demanded rapid engineering solutions and strict limits on worker exposure. It became one of the largest emergency construction projects ever undertaken. Completed later in 1986, the sarcophagus stabilized the destroyed reactor, but was never intended as a permanent solution. Aging materials and the damaged reactor beneath would require future generations to build something more durable. The work of the liquidators transformed an uncontrolled nuclear catastrophe into a site that could be monitored and managed. Their efforts significantly reduced the long-term consequences of the accident. With the immediate emergency under control, investigators turned their attention to understanding exactly why the reactor had exploded and what lessons the world needed to learn from Chernobyl. As the immediate emergency subsided, investigators sought to determine how a routine safety test had destroyed an operating nuclear reactor. Their findings would reshape nuclear engineering and safety standards around the world. A government commission led by Deputy Prime Minister Boris Sherbina brought together scientists, engineers, and officials to reconstruct the accident and identify both its immediate and underlying causes. Later in 1986, Soviet representatives presented their initial conclusions to the International Atomic Energy Agency. Early reports placed much of the responsibility on operator error and procedural violations during the turbine rundown test. Further investigation revealed that operator mistakes alone could not explain the disaster. Significant design flaws within the RBMK reactor, including its positive void coefficient and graphite-tipped control rods, played a crucial role in the explosion. The disaster was ultimately understood as the result of multiple failures acting together: reactor design weaknesses, procedural errors, inadequate communication, and an organizational culture that did not adequately prioritize nuclear safety. The investigation also exposed shortcomings in the way technical information was shared. Important characteristics of the RBMK reactor had not been fully communicated to operating crews, leaving many unaware of critical risks. Following Chernobyl, every remaining RBMK reactor underwent extensive safety modifications. Control rod designs were changed, operating limits tightened, and automatic protection systems strengthened to reduce the likelihood of a similar accident. International cooperation on nuclear safety also increased. Regulators and operators recognized that radioactive contamination ignores national borders, making transparency and information sharing essential. Long-term medical studies focused on firefighters, plant workers, liquidators, and residents exposed to radioactive fallout. These investigations continue today, providing valuable evidence about the health effects of radiation. One of the clearest documented consequences was an increase in thyroid cancer among people exposed as children to radioactive iodine, particularly in Belarus, Ukraine, and Western Russia. Early diagnosis and improved treatment have resulted in high survival rates for most patients. Estimating the wider health impact remains more complex. Scientists continue to study possible links between radiation exposure and other illnesses, while recognizing the difficulty of separating accident-related cases from naturally occurring disease. Beyond physical health, Chernobyl caused lasting psychological, economic, and social consequences. Displacement, uncertainty, and the loss of homes affected hundreds of thousands of people for decades. Attention also turned to the aging sarcophagus surrounding Reactor 4. Designed as an emergency structure, it was never intended to provide permanent containment. An international engineering effort produced the new safe confinement, a giant steel arch completed in 2016 and moved into place over the original shelter. It provides improved containment while allowing future dismantling of the damaged reactor. The new structure enables engineers to remove unstable materials and continue decommissioning work using remotely operated equipment. Even today, the reactor remains one of the world's most complex nuclear engineering projects. The lessons of Chernobyl transformed nuclear safety worldwide, reinforcing the importance of independent regulation, robust reactor design, effective training, and a culture in which safety overrides production pressures. Chernobyl demonstrated that major technological disasters rarely result from a single failure. Instead, they emerge when design weaknesses, human decisions, and organizational shortcomings combine, making continuous learning essential to preventing future accidents. Decades after the explosion, Chernobyl remains one of the most significant technological disaster sites in history. Although Reactor 4 has been stabilized, managing its radioactive remains will continue for generations. The exclusion zone has become an important scientific research area. Wildlife has returned to many abandoned regions, with wolves, elk, wild boar, and numerous bird species thriving in the absence of permanent human settlement. Their presence illustrates nature's resilience, but does not eliminate the long-lasting contamination that remains. Scientists continue monitoring soil, water, and ecosystems throughout the region. Long-lived radionuclides, particularly cesium-137 and strontium-90, remain subjects of ongoing environmental study, helping improve understanding of radiation and ecosystem recovery. Pripyat stands as a powerful reminder of the disaster's human impact. Empty apartment blocks, abandoned schools, and the city's unfinished amusement park preserve a moment in time, symbolizing lives interrupted rather than merely buildings abandoned. Following the accident, the remaining reactors at Chernobyl continued operating for several years before gradually closing. The final reactor ceased generating electricity in December 2000, ending power production at the site. In 2022, military activity during Russia's invasion of Ukraine once again focused international attention on Chernobyl. Although another nuclear disaster was avoided, the events demonstrated that the site remained strategically and environmentally significant. The lessons of Chernobyl extend beyond nuclear engineering. They highlight the importance of transparency, independent oversight, rigorous safety culture, and the willingness to act on technical warnings before they become disasters. Modern reactor designs include numerous safety improvements developed in response to accidents such as Chernobyl. International cooperation, emergency planning, and information sharing have also expanded considerably. Researchers continue studying Chernobyl from scientific, engineering, medical, and historical perspectives. Each discipline contributes to understanding not only how the accident occurred, but how similar failures can be prevented in the future. The courage of firefighters, plant workers, medical staff, helicopter crews, miners, and liquidators remains central to the story. Their actions helped prevent an already devastating accident from becoming even more severe. Chernobyl also changed the global conversation surrounding nuclear energy. Some nations reduced their reliance on nuclear power, while others strengthened safety systems and continued operating reactors under stricter regulation. The disaster cannot be explained by a single mistake or a single individual. It resulted from the interaction of flawed reactor design, human decisions, organizational shortcomings, and inadequate safety culture. The work at Reactor 4 is still not complete. Engineers will continue dismantling unstable structures and managing radioactive materials for many decades, making Chernobyl one of the longest-running engineering projects in modern history. Today, visitors entering the exclusion zone see abandoned villages, reclaimed forests, and the immense new safe confinement arch standing over Reactor 4. The landscape serves as both a memorial and a working scientific site. For those forced to leave their homes, Chernobyl is remembered through families separated from their communities, possessions left behind, and lives permanently altered. Behind every statistic lies a personal story. For engineers and scientists, the disaster remains one of history's most valuable case studies in risk management, reactor safety, and emergency response. The lessons continue to influence the design and operation of nuclear facilities worldwide. The explosions lasted only moments. The recovery has taken decades, and the responsibility for managing the site will continue well into the future. Chernobyl reminds us that advanced technology must always be matched by openness, accountability, and a commitment to learning from failure. Ignoring small weaknesses can eventually produce catastrophic consequences. The streets of Pripyat remain silent, but the lessons of Chernobyl continue to shape the modern world. Remembering what happened on the 26th of April, 1986 is not only about preserving history, it is about ensuring that such a disaster is never repeated.